In the autumn of 1944, a British reconnaissance patrol stumbled upon 50 German Panzer tanks abandoned along a French road, engines cold, crews vanished, fuel reserves untouched. Intelligence officers were baffled. No Allied bombardment had occurred, no engagement was recorded. Yet an entire armoured column had simply stopped, as if paralysed by invisible hands. The answer lay not in military strategy or technological superiority, but in the quiet determination of one woman and a humble bicycle component that became the most devastating weapon the Wehrmacht never saw coming. 23rd August 1944, 04:17 hours, Normandy, France. The air stank of cordite and burning rubber. British forward positions outside Falaise had held through another night of German counterattacks, but intelligence reports painted a grim picture that contradicted the exhausted relief of dawn. Wehrmacht panzer divisions were repositioning for a massive breakthrough operation. Intercepts suggested 3 full armoured columns, approximately 150 tanks, would converge on Allied supply lines within 72 hours. In a requisitioned farmhouse 12 kilometers behind the lines, Captain Eleanor Ashford of the Special Operations Executive stood over maps marked with red arrows that seemed to multiply with each passing hour. Aged 34, formerly a chemistry lecturer at Manchester University, she'd volunteered for SOE in 1942 after her brother's ship was torpedoed in the Atlantic. Now she commanded a cell responsible for coordinating French resistance sabotage operations across Normandy's southern sector. The strategic reality was unforgiving. Allied armour was stretched thin, pushing eastward while supply convoys struggled through bombed infrastructure. A coordinated panzer thrust could sever supply lines, trap forward divisions, and reverse weeks of hard-won territorial gains. Conventional responses had failed repeatedly. RAF bombing missions were weathered in by autumn storms, artillery couldn't reach deep enough into German-held territory, and commando raids against hardened tank formations were suicide missions that achieved little beyond casualty lists. The statistics were brutal. In the past week alone, 7 sabotage attempts against German armoured columns had failed. 17 resistance fighters killed, 12 captured, 0 tanks disabled. Wehrmacht security protocols around panzer units had been tightened to suffocating levels. Triple perimeter guards, random patrol patterns, mechanical inspections every 4 hours, fuel supplies separated from the tanks themselves and stored under armed guard. Ashford's operational mandate was explicit: find a vulnerability, exploit it, or watch the advance collapse. Traditional sabotage, explosives planted under chassis, sugar in fuel tanks, timing devices attached to ammunition stores, had proven ineffective against Wehrmacht countermeasures. Guards detected approaches, dogs patrolled perimeters. Even successful penetrations resulted in minimal damage before discovery and execution. The breakthrough came not from military thinking, but from understanding industrial vulnerability. Ashford's chemistry background revealed something Wehrmacht planners had overlooked. Sophisticated machinery contained mundane weaknesses. Panzer engines, for all their engineering excellence, relied on cooling systems, lubrication channels, and fuel injection mechanisms containing precision components vulnerable to specific chemical contamination. Local resistance contacts reported something peculiar. A German motor pool near Argentan employed French mechanics pressed into service maintaining captured equipment. One mechanic, Louise Vernet, had worked in a bicycle factory in Lille before the occupation. She possessed detailed knowledge of metallurgy, lubricants and mechanical tolerances, knowledge applicable to military vehicles despite her civilian background. The meeting occurred in a root cellar that smelled of earth and damp wool. Vernet was 41, grey-haired, hands scarred from machinery work. She'd lost her husband at Dunkirk and her son to forced labour deportation. When Ashford outlined the problem, Vernet listened without speaking for long minutes before responding in accented but precise English. "Bicycle wheel bearings," she said quietly. ball bearings packed with grease containing powdered aluminium and copper filings. When heated during operation, the mixture creates abrasive particles that destroy engine cylinder walls within 30 to 40 hours of operation. Impossible to detect visually, no immediate malfunction. By the time symptoms appear, permanent damage has occurred. The concept was elegant in its simplicity. Wehrmacht mechanics conducting routine inspections wouldn't detect contamination in sealed bearing assemblies. The sabotage would be invisible until catastrophic failure occurred, likely during operations when tanks were miles from repair facilities and stranded crews became vulnerable targets. Ashford immediately recognized both the potential and the profound risk. Manufacturing contaminated components required access to materials, tools, and time. Distribution required infiltrating German motor pools where security was absolute, and failure meant execution. Implementation required convincing local resistance cells to commit resources to an unproven strategy when immediate defensive operations were consuming every available fighter. The first resistance to the plan came from within Allied command structure. A brigadier in logistics declared the scheme fantasy thinking from civilians playing soldier. An intelligence major dismissed it as unworkable given Wehrmacht security measures. Even SOE Regional Command expressed skepticism about diverting resources toward experimental sabotage when conventional operations were understaffed. Ashford made her case with characteristic British understatement, backed by undeniable logic. Every panzer disabled behind enemy lines represents one less gun firing at our lads during the advance. If this works, we achieve strategic impact without firing a shot. If it fails, we've lost nothing conventional methods weren't already losing. Permission was granted with conditions: minimal resource allocation, plausible deniability if compromised, and absolute operational security. No official records would acknowledge the operation until, if it succeeded. The clock was running. 48 hours remained before German panzer columns would begin moving into position. In a makeshift workshop hidden in a barn outside Flers, Louise Vernet began working with materials scavenged from destroyed equipment. Bicycle components cannibalized from abandoned shops, aluminium shavings collected from aircraft wreckage, copper wire stripped from bombed factories. She worked 18-hour shifts by lamplight, assembling bearing assemblies that looked identical to standard Wehrmacht replacement parts, but contained their slow destruction within sealed housings. The operation's success required perfect execution across multiple failure points, manufacturing components indistinguishable from originals, infiltrating motor pools without detection, replacing genuine parts with contaminated versions, and exfiltrating before dawn inspections revealed the substitution. Each step carried lethal risk. Discovery meant not just death for operatives, but reprisal executions against local populations, collective punishment the Wehrmacht employed routinely. As Vernet completed the first batch of sabotage components, Ashford assembled her infiltration team: 3 French mechanics with forged Wehrmacht labor permits, 2 resistance fighters providing perimeter security, and herself as operational commander. The plan was suicidal by any rational calculation, but rationality had ceased being the governing principle of survival months ago. Desperation, improvisation, and the bloody-minded British refusal to accept defeat when alternatives existed, these were the operational parameters now. The first infiltration was scheduled for dawn in 36 hours. If successful, 50 contaminated bearing assemblies would be in Wehrmacht panzer tanks before the columns began moving. If unsuccessful, the operation would end with bodies hanging from lampposts as warnings against further resistance. Ashford spent the final evening writing letters she hoped would never be delivered. Outside, rain began falling, steady, cold, utterly indifferent to the stakes of what would unfold in the darkness ahead. 24th August 1944, 21:43 hours. Wehrmacht motorpool, Argentan. The rain had intensified into a torrent that turned the motorpool yard into a soup of mud and diesel runoff. This was both curse and blessing. Visibility dropped to 20 meters, muffling sounds and forcing guards to huddle under shelter rather than maintaining rigid patrol patterns. But it also made movement treacherous, increasing the risk of slips, dropped equipment, and attention-drawing noise. Louise Vernet moved through the darkness with the careful precision of someone who understood that survival required appearing utterly unremarkable. Her forged labor permit identified her as part of the night shift mechanics. A detail verified by actual employment records the resistance had meticulously falsified over 3 weeks. 2 other mechanics followed at staggered intervals, carrying toolboxes containing standard equipment alongside the contaminated bearing assemblies wrapped in oiled cloth. The motorpool contained 63 vehicles. Panzers, Panthers, and support vehicles arranged in precise rows under camouflage netting. Wehrmacht security was predictably thorough. Guard posts at each corner, searchlight towers, currently dark due to RAF night bomber threats, and roving patrols of Alsatian dogs with handlers. The dogs were the greatest threat, trained to detect unfamiliar scents, impossible to fool with forged papers. Vernet's plan exploited a weakness born of German efficiency itself, scheduled maintenance windows. Wehrmacht doctrine mandated that mechanical work continue regardless of operational conditions. Tanks preparing for offensive operations received priority servicing, including wheel bearing inspections and replacements. The motorpool operated on rotating 8-hour shifts. The night crew, exhausted men working under harsh conditions, followed checklists mechanically, rarely questioning routine procedures. Vernet's work assignment placed her on Panzer 417, a Panther scheduled for bearing replacement due to routine wear. She worked methodically, dismantling the wheel assembly with practiced efficiency, whilst rain drummed against the tank's sloped armor. The contaminated bearing assembly slid into place identically to the original. Visual inspection revealed no difference. Weight matched, dimensions matched. Only chemical analysis would detect the aluminium-copper powder suspended in the lubricant grease. Analysis Wehrmacht field mechanics never performed. The first 4 installations proceeded without incident. Vernet maintained the appearance of routine work. Occasional cigarette breaks in designated smoking areas, brief conversations with German supervisors about mechanical specifications, frustration expressed in broken German about working conditions. Everything carefully calibrated to project the resigned compliance of occupied French labor. The crisis came at 23:17 hours when a Wehrmacht sergeant conducting random inspections approached Vernet's workstation. He was young, perhaps 22, but carried the watchful suspicion of occupation forces who'd learned that collaboration could mask sabotage. He demanded to see the replaced bearings, the installation checklist, and Vernet's work permit. Time suspended. Vernet's forged documents were excellent, but not perfect. Prolonged scrutiny might reveal inconsistencies. The contaminated bearing assembly in her toolbox was still wrapped, awaiting installation in the next tank. Discovery would mean immediate execution, probably against the motorpool fence where other saboteurs had died. She responded with the weary irritation of a skilled worker interrupted by bureaucratic questioning. Bearing replacement, standard procedure, all documentation filed with shift supervisor. If you question my work, inspect the installation yourself. I've been doing this job since before you learned to shave. The calculated rudeness was deliberate. Excessive deference from French labor aroused suspicion, but the authentic irritation of a professional mechanic defending their competence rang true. The sergeant examined her work permit, glanced at the partially disassembled Panzer, and grunted dismissal. He moved on without inspecting the toolbox. Vernet forced herself to maintain normal breathing whilst her heart hammered against her ribs. Close, impossibly close. She returned to work with shaking hands carefully controlled to appear steady. By 02:30 hours, 37 contaminated assemblies had been installed across vehicles scheduled for the offensive operation. The infiltration team worked through exhaustion, cold, and constant fear of discovery. One mechanic was stopped twice by guards. Another faced questioning about why he was assigned to vehicles outside his normal section. Each time, forged documentation and carefully rehearsed explanations proved sufficient. The final phase was extraction, disappearing back into the civilian labor pool before dawn shift change revealed discrepancies. Vernet completed her final installation at 04:45 hours, filed falsified paperwork with the half-asleep shift supervisor, and walked through the motor pool gates with her identity card stamped for departure. Behind her, 37 Panzer tanks sat silently in the rain, each one containing its own precisely engineered destruction. The exfiltration to Allied lines took 18 hours of movement through German-held territory. Vernet travelled in a succession of civilian vehicles, a farmer's cart carrying turnips, a tradesman's lorry hauling scrap metal, finally on foot through hedgerows where American forward observers provided covering fire. She crossed into British lines at dusk on the 25th, exhausted, filthy, and carrying information that would determine the success or failure of the entire operation. Captain Ashford debriefed her in a field headquarters tent whilst artillery rumbled in the distance. The confirmed installation count was 37 sabotaged assemblies. Wehrmacht intelligence had shown no signs of discovering the operation. The Panzer columns were scheduled to begin moving at dawn on the 27th, 36 hours away. Now came the waiting. The contaminated bearings required operational heat to activate destruction, engines running at combat temperatures for 30 to 40 hours. Too soon, and Wehrmacht mechanics might diagnose and repair the damage. Too late, and the tanks would complete their operational objectives before catastrophic failure occurred. The mathematics were brutal. 37 sabotaged tanks from a total force of approximately 150 meant roughly 25% of German armoured strength would suffer mechanical failure during operations. Significant, but not decisive, unless the breakdowns occurred at operationally critical moments, during attack manoeuvres, whilst crossing difficult terrain, or when resupply was impossible. Ashford authorized surveillance teams to monitor German movements and report any indications the sabotage had been discovered. None came. Wehrmacht maintenance logs showed routine inspections finding no anomalies. The Panzer crews prepared for operations with complete confidence in their equipment. On the evening of the 26th, German armoured columns began moving into staging positions. Radio intercepts confirmed attack orders for the following dawn. Allied defensive positions braced for impact. Artillery prepared counter-battery fire. Tank destroyers moved into ambush positions along predicted approach routes. Everyone prepared for the grinding combat that had characterized Normandy operations since D-Day. Brutal, costly, and measured in meters rather than kilometers. What they didn't prepare for was silence. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of machinery failing when men needed it most. The silence of engines seizing, transmission gears grinding to immobility, and armored columns transforming from offensive weapons into 30-ton steel coffins stranded in hostile territory. That silence was still 30 hours away, but it was coming. Inevitable as dawn, carrying with it consequences that would ripple far beyond the immediate tactical situation. For Louise Vernet, sleeping exhausted in a British field hospital bed, the waiting was over. For the Panzer crews settling into their tanks for pre-attack maintenance, the waiting had just begun. 28th August 1944, 07:22 hours, German forward positions south of Falaise. Oberleutnant Hans Kessler commanded Panzer Company 7, 3rd Platoon, 14 tanks organized into a spearhead formation, tasked with breaking through Allied defensive lines and securing crossroads controlling supply routes. At 31, he was a veteran of the Eastern Front, where German armored doctrine had been refined in the brutal cauldron of Soviet warfare, aggressive maneuver, concentrated firepower, rapid exploitation of breakthroughs. The company had been moving since dawn, engines roaring through morning mist as the formation advanced along secondary roads toward designated attack positions. Everything proceeded according to plan until 7:22 hours, when Panzer 4117, lead tank of the left flank section, transmitted a mechanical alarm over company radio frequency. Engine temperature critical, oil pressure dropping, request permission to halt for inspection. Kessler granted permission with irritation, but no concern. Mechanical issues were routine in extended operations. The company halted whilst the crew of 417 conducted emergency diagnostics. Wehrmacht training emphasized self-sufficiency. Tank crews were expected to perform field repairs, carry spare components, and maintain operational status without extensive logistics support. 3 minutes later, Panzer 422 reported identical symptoms: catastrophic temperature spike, oil pressure collapse, engine seizure warnings, then 431, then 409. Within 12 minutes, 7 tanks, half his company, had suffered simultaneous mechanical failure of a type Kessler had never encountered. Engines hadn't been damaged by combat. No external sabotage was evident, yet cooling systems were failing, cylinder walls were grinding against pistons without lubrication, and temperatures were climbing toward levels that would warp engine blocks beyond field repair capability. Kessler immediately suspected sabotage, but couldn't identify the mechanism. Visual inspections revealed no tampering. Fuel samples tested clean. No explosive devices were found attached to chassis or engine compartments, yet the pattern was undeniable. Multiple tanks suffering identical failures within minutes of each other after operating under combat load for approximately 38 hours. He ordered mechanics to disassemble failed engines for detailed inspection while simultaneously reporting the situation to battalion command. The response was sharp and incredulous. Explain how 7 tanks suffer simultaneous mechanical failure without evidence of enemy action. Kessler had no explanation that satisfied Wehrmacht doctrine. German military philosophy presumed technological superiority and operational invulnerability. Equipment failures were attributed to improper maintenance, operator error, or inferior materials, never to systematic vulnerability. The concept that Allied sabotage could disable German armor through methods invisible to trained mechanics contradicted everything Wehrmacht training taught about security and mechanical integrity. Across the entire offensive front, the pattern replicated. German panzer columns preparing for coordinated attacks reported cascading mechanical failures that defied conventional diagnosis. Tanks that had passed pre-operation inspections hours earlier were now immobilized with seized engines. Wehrmacht logistics struggled to comprehend the scale. 37 tanks from 3 separate divisions, experiencing catastrophic failure within a 4-hour window. The operational impact was immediate and devastating. Attack timelines collapsed. Formations designed for coordinated maneuver lost combat effectiveness when a quarter of their strength became immobile. Supporting infantry, positioned to exploit armored breakthroughs, found themselves without the tank support necessary to overcome Allied defensive positions. Artillery preparation fires expended ammunition on schedules that presumed armored follow-through that never materialized. In divisional headquarters 15 kilometers behind the paralyzed columns, German intelligence officers confronted a perplexing mystery. The mechanical failures showed clear patterns suggesting systematic sabotage, yet security protocols should have prevented any such operation. Motor pools operated under constant surveillance. French labor was vetted, monitored, and subjected to random searches. Replacement parts came from Wehrmacht supply chains with documented provenance. One intelligence analyst, Major Wilhelm Brandt, a peacetime automotive engineer, proposed a theory his superiors initially rejected as impossible: contamination of replacement components at the manufacturing level. But Wehrmacht quality control made such sabotage theoretically impossible. Components were tested, certified, and tracked through documented supply chains. French resistance couldn't possibly infiltrate manufacturing facilities deep in Germany or corrupt Wehrmacht logistics networks without detection. What Brandt couldn't conceive, what Wehrmacht doctrine didn't permit him to consider, was that sabotage didn't require infiltrating supply chains. It only required understanding which components field mechanics replaced during routine maintenance and substituting contaminated versions during the narrow window when tanks sat in motor pools awaiting pre-offensive servicing. The simplicity was elegant, the execution was devastating, and the conceptual blindness of German military thinking prevented rapid countermeasures even after the pattern became undeniable. By mid-morning, British reconnaissance patrols reported unexpected intelligence. German armoured formations were stationary in offensive positions, with crews conducting emergency repairs. Forward artillery observers confirmed tanks being towed toward rear area repair facilities. Radio intercepts captured Wehrmacht communications expressing confusion about mechanical failures that should be impossible given pre-operation inspections. Allied command initially suspected deception, German forces feigning mechanical problems to draw British armour into ambushes. But aerial reconnaissance confirmed the reality. Dozens of Panzer tanks genuinely immobilized, some abandoned entirely when repair proved impossible in field conditions. Crews were visible, conducting desperate maintenance under conditions that made vulnerability painfully obvious. British tank destroyers and anti-tank artillery repositioned to engage targets that couldn't maneuver to avoid fire. What should have been a mobile armoured battle became a methodical destruction of immobilized targets. German casualties mounted not from superior Allied armour or tactical brilliance, but from simple mechanical paralysis that transformed offensive weapons into stationary targets. The Wehrmacht response evolved from confusion to desperate improvisation. Mechanics cannibalized parts from disabled tanks to restore mobility to others. Entire formations were reorganized around reduced vehicle counts. Attack plans were hastily revised to account for diminished armored strength. But improvisation couldn't overcome the fundamental reality. The offensive had been gutted before contact with enemy forces, done in by an invisible sabotage that Wehrmacht security protocols had failed to prevent or detect. In Berlin, High Command demanded explanations. How had Allied sabotage penetrated Wehrmacht security? What vulnerability had been exploited? How could future operations be protected? The questions came with implicit threats. Failure to identify and rectify the security breach would result in courts-martial, dismissals, and potential accusations of defeatism or collaboration. The answers, when mechanics finally disassembled failed engines completely and subjected components to metallurgical analysis, were both revealing and humiliating. Contaminated bearing assemblies, abrasive particles in lubricant, precision components destroyed by substances that should never have been present. The sabotage was simple, almost crude by Wehrmacht standards, yet it had succeeded because German doctrine presumed technological invulnerability rather than preparing for asymmetric threats. By evening of the 28th, German offensive operations across the southern Normandy sector had collapsed entirely. Some formations retained combat capability, but coordinated armoured manoeuvre, the foundation of Wehrmacht tactical doctrine, was impossible with fragmented understrength units operating alongside immobilized comrades awaiting repair or evacuation. Allied forces, initially braced for desperate defensive fighting, instead found themselves advancing against disorganized resistance. The psychological impact was significant. German troops who'd relied on armored superiority now questioned the reliability of their equipment. French resistance cells, emboldened by the visible success of sabotage, increased operations. And British command recognized that sometimes the most effective weapon wasn't firepower or technological superiority, but simply understanding your enemy's vulnerabilities and exploiting them with precision. The woman responsible for designing that exploitation was sleeping in a field hospital, her name unknown to the commanders whose operations she'd saved, her contribution destined to remain classified for decades. But the 37 immobilized Panzers told her story more eloquently than any medal or commendation ever could. 15th September 1944, Allied Forward Headquarters, France. The final accounting came 3 weeks after the sabotage operation, when captured Wehrmacht maintenance records and Allied intelligence assessments could be correlated into comprehensive operational analysis. Captain Eleanor Ashford stood before a map in a requisition chateau outside Paris, now serving as SOE regional headquarters, and briefed senior officers on Operation Bearing, the official designation assigned retrospectively to Louise Vernet's bicycle component, sabotage. The statistics were extraordinary in their strategic impact. 37 successfully sabotaged tanks from a planned offensive force of 148 represented 25% combat degradation before enemy contact. But the operational consequences exceeded simple numerical reduction. Coordinated armored maneuver required concentration of force at decisive points. The random distribution of mechanical failures across multiple formations prevented effective reorganization. Attack timelines collapsed when supporting units couldn't coordinate with immobilized armor. German commanders, trained to execute precise operational plans, struggled to improvise when foundational assumptions about equipment reliability proved invalid. Allied casualties during the period of expected German offensive operations were 70% lower than tactical models had predicted. British tank destroyer units reported engaging immobilized targets that couldn't return effective fire. Infantry positions that should have been overrun by armored breakthrough instead held with minimal reinforcement. Supply lines that German planners had designated for interdiction continued operating uninterrupted, enabling Allied advance to accelerate rather than stall. The broader strategic impact rippled beyond immediate tactical victories. Wehrmacht High Command, already strained by concurrent operations across multiple fronts, diverted resources toward investigating security vulnerabilities. Motor pool protocols were comprehensively revised, requiring extended inspection procedures that slowed maintenance operations. French labor was removed entirely from sensitive facilities, forcing German mechanics to absorb workload increases when manpower was already critically scarce. Replacement components faced metallurgical testing that created logistics bottlenecks and delayed repairs. The operational paranoia imposed costs that exceeded the direct sabotage damage. German forces across occupied territories began suspecting every mechanical failure as potential sabotage, even when genuine equipment wear or operator error was responsible. The psychological impact of invisible vulnerability, the understanding that enemies could attack through methods impossible to detect or prevent, eroded confidence in technological superiority that German military culture relied upon. For Louise Vernet, the aftermath brought neither public recognition nor comfortable retirement. SOE policy maintained absolute operational security around agents and collaborators. Her name appeared in classified files accessible only to intelligence officers with appropriate clearances. No medal was awarded publicly, no newspaper carried stories of her contribution. She was debriefed, thanked in formal language that conveyed institutional appreciation whilst revealing nothing of personal emotion, and asked to sign documentation acknowledging legal consequences of discussing classified operations. She returned to civilian life in liberated France with identity papers that contained no mention of her wartime service. The bicycle factory in Lille, where she'd learned mechanical engineering, had been destroyed by bombing. She found employment in Paris, working in a precision instrument workshop where her metallurgical knowledge was valued, but her wartime application of that knowledge remained unmentioned and unknown. Years would pass before historians gained access to declassified SOE records revealing Operation Bearing's existence. Initial academic papers dismissed it as marginal footnote, interesting but operationally insignificant compared to major battles and campaigns that dominated historical narrative. Only careful analysis of Wehrmacht logistics records, cross-referenced with British intelligence assessments and French resistance archives, revealed the operation's true strategic impact. The recognition, when it finally came in the 1970s, was bittersweet. Louise Vernet had died in 1968, aged 65, without ever publicly discussing her wartime service. Her children learned of her contribution from journalists researching newly declassified documents. Neighbors who'd known her for decades were stunned to discover the quiet woman who'd worked in the instrument shop had once disabled German armored formations with bicycle components and chemistry knowledge. The French government awarded a posthumous Croix de Guerre. British authorities issued formal acknowledgement of her SOE service and contribution to Allied victory. Her name was added to memorial plaques honoring French resistance fighters whose sacrifices enabled liberation. But these official recognitions couldn't restore the recognition she deserved during her lifetime, couldn't give her the satisfaction of knowing her courage had been witnessed and valued by the nation she'd served. Captain Ashford's post-war career followed the typical pattern of SOE officers: returned to civilian life with wartime service classified, career opportunities constrained by inability to discuss relevant experience, gradual fading into obscurity as public attention focused on conventional military heroics rather than clandestine operations. She returned to Manchester University, resumed teaching chemistry, and never mentioned during lectures that she'd once coordinated sabotage operations that altered the trajectory of major military campaigns. The strategic lessons from Operation Bearing were absorbed into military doctrine, though often without attribution to the specific operation. Post-war analysis of asymmetric warfare incorporated concepts of exploiting technological vulnerabilities through unconventional means. Special operations training emphasized identifying enemy assumptions about security and attacking those assumptions rather than hardened defenses. The recognition that sometimes the most effective weapon was understanding your enemy's blind spots rather than matching their strengths. This insight, born from a bicycle component and a French mechanic's determination, influenced military thinking for decades. In the final accounting, Operation Bearing represented something fundamental about British character during the Second World War. The refusal to accept defeat when alternatives existed, no matter how unconventional or desperate those alternatives might be. The willingness to trust civilian expertise and improvised solutions when conventional military approaches failed. The capacity to maintain operational security and determination through years when victory seemed uncertain and costs seemed unbearable. Louise Vernet never wore a uniform, never fired a weapon in combat, and never received public recognition during her lifetime. Yet her contribution was as vital as any soldier who fought in the fields of Normandy, any pilot who flew through flak-filled skies, or any sailor who braved U-boat-infested waters. She demonstrated that courage takes many forms, that strategic impact isn't measured solely in battlefield victories, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon is simply understanding your enemy's vulnerabilities better than they understand them themselves. The 37 immobilized Panzers stood as testament to that truth, silent, rusting monuments to the reality that wars are won, not just through firepower and technological superiority, but through intelligence, creativity, and the determination of individuals who refuse to accept that critical problems have no solutions. In the grey zones between conventional military operations and civilian resistance, in the spaces where improvisation meets expertise and desperation meets determination, history is shaped by anonymous heroes whose names are forgotten but whose impacts endure. Louise Vernay was one such hero. Her bicycle components disabled more enemy armor than some entire tank battalions destroyed through conventional combat. Her legacy lives not in monuments or medals, but in the recognition that every individual possesses potential to influence history if they possess the courage to act when action is needed, regardless of personal risk or hope of recognition. If you found this story of forgotten courage and ingenious sabotage compelling, please subscribe to our channel for more untold stories from the Second World War that reveal how ordinary individuals achieved extraordinary impacts through determination and ingenuity. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What other underappreciated contributions to Allied victory deserve recognition? Ring the notification bell so you never miss our explorations of history's hidden heroes who changed the world through quiet courage and brilliant improvisation. Their stories deserve to be remembered.